Thank you, David. I'd like to call Anna Greenberg and Speaker Jason Frierson up to the stage now. We're going to start with Anna, who is going to go through some of the numbers and what we can extrapolate from them to try and keep painting the picture of what happened during the election. Anna is a pollster with Greenberg Quinlan. She has more than 15 years of experience in polling in the political, nonprofit, and academic sectors, and has worked for some of the country's top leaders, movements, and appears regularly on television. This past election cycle, she not only worked on the presidential race, she also did polling at the state legislative level in Iowa, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and New Mexico. She is probably as well positioned as anyone to talk about the effects of the top of the ticket dynamics on legislative races. Anna?
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak to this group. As Nick mentioned, I actually do a fair amount of work at the state legislative level. It was a tough year, as you all know, and I really think there is no more important work than what you do. As I say all the time to people, where government really affects people's lives is at the state and local level. And hopefully this election will be finally the wake-up call that the Democratic Party and the progressive movement needs to truly, truly invest in what we do down the ballot. The stakes couldn't be higher. I don't know where the PowerPoint is, or, oh, there it is, okay. Okay, so I'm going to talk about what happened this election, put some numbers onto some of the things that David Brock spoke about, and some of this will be very familiar to you, so I'll go through it pretty quickly. I don't think we have a ton of time in the panel left, so I'm a fast talker anyway, so I'll get through it pretty quickly. We know what happened. I don't think we need to dwell on this slide for very long, but obviously, as David Brock noted, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote while losing the Electoral College. The thing to note here is that overall, even though Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by 2 points, she actually fell short in terms of share of the vote to Barack Obama's performance in 2008 and 2012. And I think one of the things we really have to look at as progressives and Democrats is that over the 8 years of the Obama administration, there was decreasing support for Democrats over time. So we can talk about all of the reasons why Hillary Clinton lost this election and why we saw losses down the ballot, but we have to put it into the context of the last 8 years. And as you know, there's been a lot of erosion of Democratic electeds at the state level, certainly at the federal level, in some ways more than what we saw during the second term, for example, of the Bush administration. And so again, we need to look at ourselves as much as we look at the larger environment where we lost this election. You'll note, by the way, that Donald Trump does not actually really increase his Republican share of the vote. So this is really in some ways about our side and how we lost with our base over the last 8 years. If you look, for example, at Barack Obama's re-elect in 2012, if you look, I have data here going back to Eisenhower. Most people who are elected to a second term win by a bigger margin than the margin that they were initially elected by. You can see here that Obama was the first president to be reelected by a smaller margin in 2012 than he was in 2008 compared to other presidents who are elected to a second term. Again, reinforcing the notion that we need to look at ourselves as much as we look at the other causes of the loss of Hillary Clinton losing this election and the losses down the ballot. And I can talk a little bit more about that later. Now, what you can see here is that this election was largely lost in the Midwest, though obviously losing Florida and North Carolina didn't help either. But as you all know from all of the prognostication websites, Hillary Clinton could have won this election while losing states like Florida and North Carolina, as long as she held the kind of firewall in the Midwest. And I would also include kind of, even though Pennsylvania is not in the Midwest, there's a lot of the way that state felt very similar to what happened in the Midwest. But you can see where the counties that Trump won. You know, Trump won counties that Obama won twice. That means there are people who voted for Barack Obama who voted for Donald Trump this election cycle. Again, we're pointing to some of the weaknesses on our side of this election. But you can see the highest concentration of switching votes, if you will, comes in these Midwestern counties and also some more conservative parts, for example, of Maine and upstate New York. You know, places that have high concentration of white blue-collar workers. Again, you can see here that actually Trump outperformed Romney in those places. It's interesting because if you look at the share of the vote that Trump got overall, it's not all that different. In fact, it's a point less than what Romney got, but it was very much a geographic concentration of overperformance for Trump that swung the election his way. And it makes, by the way, some sense that Trump did better than Romney in this part of the country, even though Romney's from Michigan. Romney himself is an elite, very rich, pretty disconnected from regular working people, even though Trump is also rich and disconnected from working people. He had, let's be clear, there's no question that he had a way to speak to white working class voters that was quite different than Mitt Romney, and you can see where Trump overperformed relative to Mitt Romney's performance. Now, what happened demographically, we've heard a lot of discussion of the white working class vote, and I'm going to disagree a little bit with David Brock on his interpretation of what happened with white working class voters, but there are a bunch of other dynamics that have happened at the same time. The first is, if you look at the gender gap was actually bigger this cycle than it's been in recent memory. It was about a 24-point gender gap, meaning that Trump won men by about 12 points, and Clinton won women by about 12 points. That's a 24-point gender gap. So there was an enormous gender gap. And the gender gap was actually not just overall, but within almost every demographic subgroup, including, by the way, Democratic-based voters. So, for example, African-American women were about 15 points more likely to support Clinton than African-American men. Latinas, much more likely, about 20 points more likely to support Hillary Clinton than Latino men. Now, they did not vote for Trump, they voted third party. So Trump's share of the vote, notwithstanding what the exit polls have said, among minority voters was not bigger than Romney. It was sort of a typical Republican performance, but you had minority men voting disproportionately for third-party candidates. So that the gender gap, holds among every group, including, white college-educated voters, every single group. It really does speak to the sexism that David Brock talked about, which is something that hasn't really been spoken about a ton as we focus on lots of other groups of voters. There is an underlying sexism in some of the gender dynamics in voting in this election cycle. You can see that Trump improved. By the way, I know this is a confusing slide, but the nets that are above the columns there, if it's a red plus, that means Trump did 5 points better than Romney. So you can see that Trump did 5 points better with men than Romney did. You can see that actually Hillary Clinton did even a little bit better than Barack Obama among women. And there has been a lot of discussion about the idea that women didn't show up in this election. That's just actually not true. First of all, Hillary Clinton did slightly better among women than Obama did. Really what happened was internal sorting. So actually, Hillary Clinton did historically well with college-educated women. She won college-educated women. Now, keep in mind, Romney won college-educated women. However, she did really badly with blue-collar women. And so in net terms, she did the same as Obama among women, but internally, if you look at the women's vote, there was internal shifting, but this notion that kind of women didn't show up is simply not true. Also, I don't have it up here, but if we look at the millennial vote, that is also a place, first of all, where there's a very big gender gap. And one of the things that I saw throughout the cycle when I did focus groups with millennial men is a lot of millennial men had a very big problem with Hillary Clinton. Some of that comes from what happened in the primaries with Bernie Sanders. And in fact, only about 85% of millennials who voted for Bernie Sanders voted for Hillary Clinton. The rest voted third party. In fact, Trump did worse among millennials than Romney did, but you had that third party vote mostly driven by millennial men. And so it is true that millennials didn't show up in the same numbers, though we won't know for some time what turnout looks like, and they were somewhat less likely to support Hillary Clinton than they were Barack Obama in 2012. Not actually hugely different, frankly, but again, internal to the millennial vote, a lot of division around gender, a lot of division around race, a lot of division around class. So within every kind of big group of voters, you have to understand that internally there was lots of division, that some of which was to be expected and some of it which was magnified. It was on steroids, if you will, on this election cycle. I'd also note, by the way, that both Trump and Clinton consolidated their base support at the same level, and that's actually really important for understanding in some ways the impact of the Comey letter at the end of the election, which is to say that for most of the election, we had a much higher undecided vote in the presidential that we usually have. We had anywhere from 10 to 20% of people, depending on the poll, saying they were undecided. That's really unprecedented. Partisanship is such a driver of choice at the presidential level. You almost never have more than 2 or 5% of people saying they're undecided. Towards the end of the election, a lot of the undecided vote were Republicans who were dissatisfied with Trump, flirting with voting for Johnson, flirting with not voting at all. I do believe that one of the most important impacts of the Comey letter was consolidated Republicans and having Republicans kind of come home to Trump. And so you can see that Clinton and Trump got about the same percentage of their partisans. By the way, they both underperformed with their base. I mean, I believe that Barack Obama got around 95% of Democrats. But you can also see that that Trump also won independent voters. But his performance with independents was not any better than Barack Obama's. So you have both of them a little bit weaker among their base, but got the same level of consolidation, performed the same with independent voters. And so at the end of the day, a lot of what drives this election was turnout, which is to say that if Democrats were less likely to turn out with Republicans, which is something I think we already know and will know more definitively when voter files are updated, that was a big driver of what happened in this very, very close election. I want to speak about the white working class vote for a minute. You can see here that there was a very, very, very big class division in voting this cycle. You can see here, if you look at white college women, Hillary Clinton won 51%. As I mentioned, Romney won white college-educated women in 2012. You can see, if you look at white college men, there was for a time a belief that white college men would actually not support Donald Trump, but you can see that he won them by 15 points. So a pretty big gender gap there. But look at the white non-college women, 62% voted for Trump. White non-college men, 72% voted for Trump. Now, these are people without a college education. It is certainly possible that some of them make $70,000 a year. So I think we have to be careful around income level and education level. So while it is true, David Brock is absolutely correct, if you looked at the primary, that Trump supporters were not poor, they were not low income, and I'm sure it's true that the median income of Trump supporters here was also higher because, let's face it, the people with the lowest incomes in this country are African American and Latino, and they vote more Democratic. So of course, Trump supporters are going to be higher income. But in class terms, they are very, very heavily non-college and blue-collar. That 72% is about 10 points higher than Mitt Romney got with white blue-collar men. It is dramatic. So I'm going to just quickly talk about sort of what happened in terms of how people saw this election and what it meant. The main thing to say is that, people were pretty unhappy about the lack of progress in this country. And this is a place where I'm also going to differ a little bit than David Brock around his analysis of this election being about identity politics and versus being about the economy. First of all, I think those two issues are completely intertwined. It is very hard to separate out somebody who is unhappy about losing out to some out group, African Americans, immigrants, from the decline of manufacturing, the wage stagnation. These issues are intertwined. You cannot disentangle them. So I think, and I don't think we need to disentangle them. But there isn't any question that even though by most macroeconomic measures the country is doing very well, growth is lower than we might like it to be, but unemployment historically low, and we're finally starting to see some actual growth in wages, but still not back to 2007 levels in terms of income. But people really feel like things didn't get better under Barack Obama, even though objectively many things have gotten better. And let's be clear, that's also true of some Democrats too. And that's, again, going back to this notion of looking at our own base and our own folks. Okay, we have a lot of people, a lot of Democrats who have struggled since this recovery for all the reasons that you all know about at the state level. And so thinking about the last 8 years and how as a movement and as a party we've talked about the economy and talked about the economic challenges that people have faced. Let's face it, the last 5-6 weeks of the Clinton campaign was focused on continuing the progress and continuity with Barack Obama, which went directly at odds with 65% of people in this country thinking we're on the wrong track, with most people thinking things really haven't gotten much better in this country. So it was sort of a tone-deaf way to end the campaign in the context of a changed election. I'm not suggesting she could have won or lost if she'd had a different message at the end or a more consistent economic message throughout the cycle. I believe that there's a good chance she would have won if there had been a consistent economic message from the Clinton campaign, with all the caveats about how hard it was to break through the email stories and Russian hacking. No question she did not have sort of an unmediated platform in the way Donald Trump did in cable news and the like. But nevertheless, having, I think, a strong economic message that was consistent from beginning to end, and ending the campaign talking about the continued challenges that people face and how progressives and Democrats were going to take on those challenges, in my view, would have been more responsive to where this electorate is than a continuity, build on the change, build on success message, which is how both the president and Hillary Clinton closed out the last 5-6 weeks of this campaign. So you can see on most issues, people feel like we haven't made a lot of progress in this country over the last 8 years, and that really was the overall context of this election, along with all the other strangeness of the Trump campaign and Russian hacking and that sort of thing. It was all overlaid on an electorate that feels like things have not gotten better in this country, and that's something that we really, really have to take in and understand. I'm going to breeze through some of these slides here. Just to note that a plurality of people in the exit polls said they were looking for change as opposed to experience and other, caring about people, and you can see that Donald Trump won those change voters overwhelmingly. You can also see that on the economy, that at least in terms of this electorate that showed up, that people didn't feel good about economic progress, and it's also the case you can see that Trump won slightly overall. I know that David Brock talked about what happened in the state exit polls, but overall, you can see that Trump had a slight advantage over Hillary Clinton on the economy. And that is something that, as we tracked through the election cycle, we saw throughout, which is that he had an advantage on trade, on jobs, on those kinds of economic issues. She had an advantage on being for the middle class and caring about people, but he had an advantage on the notion of job creation. And by the way, in 2012, Romney also beat Barack Obama on the economy. Barack Obama beat Romney on being better for the middle class, Romney on the economy. So there's been this ongoing challenge for Democrats and President Obama to kind of convince voters that we kind of know what to do about the economy. It's, again, in the context of a larger set of issues, not just this election. Trump was more of a protest vote. And I would note, by the way, and this is where I think this whole question of why people vote for Trump is really interesting. 20% of Trump voters actually voted for him even though they thought he wasn't qualified. A percentage of people voted for Trump even though they didn't like his views on women. A percentage voted for him who did not think he had the temperament. And so this vote for Trump, in some ways, was, for some chunk of Trump voters, was less about Trump himself and more about trying to send a message to the system about how they felt about how things were going in this country. And again, I think for us as progressives and Democrats, we need to look at what kind of message some of those voters were sending, because it wasn't, for many of them, it really wasn't about Trump. It was about something bigger. I'm going to close by just saying, and this is the whole question of mandate, it is also, we should also be clear, you saw it with as David Brock mentioned, the progressive ballot initiatives that passed across the country, but even some of the questions just in the exit polls, questions about immigration, questions about a wall, people actually don't really agree with Donald Trump's positions on most things, and even on Obamacare, quote-unquote Obamacare, you can see that people are divided in the exit polls on whether or not we should repeal Obamacare. So the notion that there's an ideological mandate for Donald Trump is just absurd on its face. Nevertheless, he is running the government, his appointees will run the government, and they will do it in a very conservative and damaging way. But we should make no mistake, people are with us, not with them, and I agree with David Brock that actually now is the time to fight, even be obstructionist in my view. I don't know why we wouldn't, to try to stop really bad things from happening in this country. I want to say one final thing about what happened at the state legislative level, and I'll stop. This was as someone who worked for the Iowa Senate caucus, the Pennsylvania House caucus, the House caucus in Minnesota, states in that slide where the counties were circled for Trump, those were really hard places to hold on to or try to regain majorities. It is very difficult to outperform the top of the ticket. In Iowa, Clinton lost by 10 points. You're asking candidates to really outperform what's happening. It is almost impossible to do that unless you have one certain individual who's so personally beloved you can kind of buck the trend, but it is very, very, very difficult. And that's just true, that's just I think just true of campaigns universally. But I think this year was even harder because I think it was very difficult for voters to focus on anything but the top of the ticket. And I did focus groups in Buck County in September, and I was working in a congressional race there, and also working in the House races there, the state House races. And we kept trying to talk about what's happening in Harrisburg, and we kept trying to talk about what's happening in Bucks and Montgomery County. And they said, we don't want to talk about that. I can only think about the presidential election. So our ability to actually communicate about anything below president and maybe Senate was really, really limited in this election cycle. So I'm not trying to sort of say campaigns don't matter under the top of the ticket. They absolutely do. But I found in the work that I did this cycle that it was very hard to get voters focused on anything but the presidential election. And we certainly had campaigns where, we communicated at the same level as Republicans did and still didn't win, even in swing districts because of what was happening at the top of the district, top of the ticket. So for me, working in this cycle was enormously frustrating. I worked for some amazing incumbents, amazing candidates, great progressive, effective leaders, and the noise at the top of the ticket made it so incredibly difficult. I'm sure you experienced yourself in your own re-election campaigns, so incredibly difficult below the bottom to get any voter to focus on it. So much of what happened at the state legislative level this cycle was a function of what happened at the top of the ticket. But That being said, we have to be part of the solution. 2018 is going to be about what happens at the state level. The U.S. Senate is a disaster in terms of a map. It couldn't be more important to win back legislative seats. It couldn't be more important to win back governor's mansions, particularly as we approach redistricting, and not just for federal district lines, but your district lines in your states. Pennsylvania is impossible, as you know. I mean, it is just it's one of the worstly drawn states in the country. So nothing is more important than rebuilding from the bottom up and taking what lessons we can from this election, and I think in particular, really trying to understand why people are so frustrated with this country, what we can do to make their lives better. Thank you.